You are live.
Thank you. Very good. We'll begin the Housing Committee of Akron City Council. I should technically say the Housing and Neighborhood Assistance Committee for the record. And roll call, Ms. Viviano.
Fusco.
Aye.
Swirsky. Samples.
Aye.
McKittrick.
Aye.
Connor.
Aye.
All committee members are present except for Councilman Swirsky.
Thank you, Sarah Viviano. Okay, we'll begin this committee meeting. We do have, there's two items on the regular agenda. However, it's important to note that the first item, we have a substitute that I'm going to ask the deputy clerk to read in for the first item in reference to land usage and the environmental health housing code. So could you please read in that substitute, Ms. Viviano?
Sure. Substitute offered as an amendment. Ordinance amending and or supplementing Title 15 land usage, Chapter 150 Environmental Health Housing Code to add sections 150.51 and 150.52 to create legal defenses in an eviction matter for tenants who attempt to tender all past due rental payments to a landlord, and capping the amount of reasonable late fees that a landlord may impose on a tenant and declaring an emergency.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Viviano. Thank you for that. Is there someone here wishing to speak on this item? Anyone here?
Council Chairman Fusco,
Yes.
this is Tamika Rose. Hi.
Hi, Tamika Rose. Yes, thank you.
I wanted to have this amendment and to clarify the language that we were only speaking to residential properties, not commercial properties, and that we wanted to also make sure to clarify that if a tenant held their past due rent in escrow, that could be an affirmative defense. And so those are the changes, clarifying changes that we made to the amendment, to the legislation.
Okay, thank you very much. On this particular item, I'm going to request to the committee that we take time. There's a lot of different moving parts to this, but in terms of the substitute itself, I'm going to ask if there's any committee members have any particular questions in reference to this particular proposal. Ms. Samples?
Not really a question. I'm glad that you all added the question about putting the rent in escrow, because I think that's something that a lot of tenants aren't aware of if they don't know anyone from the court system or have an attorney to represent them. So I commend you all on adding that to it. I think it just makes it a more robust piece of legislation. Also, I just want to say for the record, I hope that we can bring this for a vote next week, even though we're going to probably take time this week. I'm just more concerned about a piece of legislation that's been in front of us for weeks to go over and have questions about and ask the questions or concerns that we may have had, but we still have people who are facing eviction while we're sitting on this. So I do hope that we will be able to bring this for a vote next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much for bringing forward that concern. As the chair, I'm asking that we give council an opportunity to get all their questions answered. I've spoken to several council members who've brought forward some concerns, and I want to make sure that everyone gets all their questions answered. Reference to that, though, is there a, I want to ask this question. Is there a moratorium currently in reference to this, to evictions and such within our court system existing today?
So, Councilman Fusco, there is a current moratorium. However, even though there has been a moratorium since last year, the court has still evicted over 1,500 people in 2020. So even though the moratorium exists, landlords are still filing evictions.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Thank you. Thank you. I see Mr. Hardy's hand is up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I referenced the making sure council members get their questions answered. I've not received a single question from any council member in the last 3 weeks. So if there are questions that are not answered, please send them to Tamika or myself. if we can answer them or get them to the right person to get answered. But to date, over the last 3 weeks, I've received no questions.
I'll make sure you get them all. Very good, sir. Any other questions or comments from anyone? Mr. Malik.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just want to clarify, for all the members that it's my perspective that the change that's made was more or less just correcting language, clarifying language, and not so much of a substantive change. There was language that, if the pay to stay could be implemented in certain situations before an eviction was filed as an affirmative defense, and then it said after an eviction was filed just as a defense. But that affirmative defense, it has to do with the burden of proof. So we want to make sure it says the same before and after. So I just, I think it's important that we recognize that it was just to clarify what could be misinterpreted. It wasn't to make a substantive change. So no, I think it's important that we all are able to answer questions, that we're all on the same page as to what happens here. I know I've gotten a couple calls from folks who don't really understand the legislation, landlords and others. And then when I explain it, folks say, oh, okay, well, if it's not just a promise that I'm going to get late rent and late fees, but actually it's actually there before the eviction is dismissed, then I'm fine with it, So I think if we kind of are sure to explain it to folks in a way that makes sense, I think everyone sees it as a matter of fairness. But I do hope that we can answer those questions in short order and then come to a vote on this so that we do protect folks.
Absolutely. Ms. Amobian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my question has to do with, do we know exactly how the court has been able to get around the moratorium? Does anybody know?
Mr. Chairman, I can.
Mr. Hardy?
So Councilwoman Amobian, there are essentially waivers or documents that need to be signed by the tenant verifying that or testifying to the fact that I am having these issues as a result of COVID-19. And in the absence of those, the court is evicting because they're essentially saying that there are other issues at play that are not COVID related. When in fact, I would venture to say most of the evictions are in some way, shape, or form COVID related, and the documentation is not there simply because the tenant is not aware that that is even a necessity, or that those exist, or that is needed in order to gain those protections. There is a sense in the community, not just in Akron but everywhere, that when the CDC or the president or someone says no evictions, they're protected. That's not the case, and so there's just a lack of understanding of the process. And in the absence of that understanding, evictions are proceeding.
So is anybody trying to educate these people so they know what to do about signing some documents or making it known that their situation is the result of or enhanced by the COVID-19? It may not be totally caused by, but it's only made it worse.
That's a good question. Can anyone answer that in terms of the educational piece, Mr. Hardy? Thank you.
I'll defer to Ms. Rose, if that's okay.
Oh, Ms. Rose? Okay, yeah, thanks.
I know that if people go to legal aid, they are aware of these. They will receive the proper education, and I also know that if they go reach out to 211, they will get that education. But I do not know of if you don't reach out to a nonprofit in the community that currently works on this, if it is actively being pushed out that way. And I think the support may have, that's
I would hope that they're reaching out, to be honest.
So do we have any money to do billboards or any kind of PR? I mean, there has to be a way to do a PSA or something to help these folks understand, because that's part of the problem that we face in so many areas, that people just don't understand their rights. And because of that, they are actually being, taken advantage of, or whatever the case may be. And I'm not saying that the landlords don't deserve, they deserve to be paid, but people don't deserve to be homeless because of no fault of their own. So there has to be a way for us to enhance whatever is happening or not happening. So do we have any resources within these cares or wherever that we can use to do something to make people aware of their rights?
Ms. Moby, I'm glad you asked that. That's a great question. It really is. And I appreciate it. And that's some of those funds that we are receiving, reference to COVID-19 funds. We could put that on the table. We had a discussion last week in reference to those expenditures. And if our nonprofits out there can't seem to figure out a way to get to folks, then
They
we
probably
need
don't
to
have any
figure that
money.
out. I think that would be a prudent thing for us to look at. And I was under the impression too that there was outside the court or whatever, they were, maybe somebody can answer this, but like a kiosk or something where you whenever you walk in, urge people to go to this resource. I know a couple of years ago, some folks in the community talked about that, that kind of thing where we can get people before they even get into the courtroom. But I would support that, Ms. Moby, and I think that's worthy of council's discussion.
Yeah, but it sounds like we're at a crisis point now. Can we not take money that we know is coming and start doing something right away instead of just waiting?
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying that we just had a conversation last week about that $1 million that we have for council, and that money should be used, and we can make that a priority to try to push this out to encourage tenants, as well as possibly landlords, to educate everyone across the board in terms of, if you have a problem, utilize this method. So no, I absolutely support what you're saying. I think that's
no. I hear what you're saying too, and I thank you for that. But I'm just wondering, how soon can we do this?
Well, we just have to put together a program, and that's where the work would come in. But yeah, I'm happy to talk to President Somerville about that, and yourself, Ms. Moby, and others on council, to see what we can do to push this out.
Okay.
Well, yeah,
Thank you.
I think that's a great idea. I like it a lot. And I honestly don't know whose hands were up first. So I think Mr. Malik's hand may have been up first. I don't know.
I'll defer to Ms. Samples. I think
Okay. Ms. Samples?
Yeah, just briefly. I think it is incumbent about council to, if you have questions about the process, I think it is very informative if you all reach out to the magistrates who handle the eviction hearings at the courthouse that are still going forward, and participate in one of their Zoom eviction hearings so you all can see the process and the fact that people are still being evicted. As of last week, no one on council had attended any of these hearings. So I would encourage you all to reach out either to one of the magistrates or to Montrella Jackson to get the link to see that process. I think it's important to understand why there is such an urgency for such a piece of legislation, and why we are getting the emails now from our constituents in the city of Akron and even across the county as to this being a major issue in not just our city, but across the state of Ohio. There's some very prominent people sending us emails in here who are elated that we're actually having this conversation so we could stop being the state and the city who has such a high eviction rate, especially during COVID. So I don't know if you all have seen the emails or read the emails. I know I've gotten several of them. And again, I just encourage you all to reach out to the courthouse, because I think it's important to actually understand the process and to see why this is so urgent. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Samples, for that. Appreciate it. Just trying to make sure everyone has an opportunity to, and the process is everyone is comfortable with regards to knowing exactly what we're voting on and exactly the impact. This is huge. This is very big legislation, and I appreciate it coming forward. I appreciate the discussion. And some of us on council, from talking to some folks, I don't know if which I think they're still learning exactly what's happening and how this is going to look after it's passed or not passed, what have you. But I think everyone shares the concern, but I think I'm just trying to respect the process as well. Mr. Malik.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Ms. Mobian raises a really important question. You know, there is a eviction moratorium, but I think tenants often don't necessarily know their rights because the system is so complex. I mean, I know, legal aid does a lot of good work. Fair Housing Contact Services, I think they're having a tenants education program tomorrow. So I think those are things that we can, work on assisting them. But I think one thing that really would be a more medium-term solution, and that's something rescue plan money can help with, is a right to counsel program. Because most landlords have attorneys. Most tenants, when they show up, if they show up, don't have attorneys. And so they have to operate in this courtroom without any support. In Cleveland, they put aside a particular amount of money, and they created, in collaboration with the municipal court, a right to counsel program so that folks have an opportunity to have a lawyer by their side navigating this. And this isn't just a plug for lawyers, it's not self-interested, but I really do think this is something we can look at when it comes to the rescue plan money, because ultimately education efforts are only going to go so far. The system is complex enough that you really do need someone by your side, which is why landlords who can't afford it all do have a lawyer by their side. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Mr. Malik. No, I certainly appreciate it. And Mr. Hardy, I haven't forgot about you. I know your hand was up previously. Did you have something to add? If it's okay with Ms. Baylor. Did you have something else?
No, sir.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, Ms. Baylor and then Ms. Connor.
I was just gonna piggyback with Councilwoman Omobian and Councilman Malik. The communication and education has always been a challenge for most cities and most municipalities. And the legal counsel, and like Councilman Malik was saying, some type of program that would permit that, or maybe some of the funds, like he said, that we would get can go into something like that to help people when they come before the magistrate or the judge for these eviction issues. So, but everything has to connect. I mean, the dots have to be connected in order for anything to work. So the people who are directly at the front line have to be involved in the process in order for it to work. So however that looks, or whatever that takes, then that's something we should probably work towards to try to make happen, so both the landlords and the tenants can be satisfied.
Thank you, Ms. Baylor. Thank you for that. Ms. Connor?
These documents that say I need the moratorium because of COVID-19 that legal aid has, are they extensive, or is it just like a 1 or 2 page thing? Does anybody know? And if it isn't extensive, can we get a copy of it that we can forward to people who contact us in our neighborhoods, or that we could put out to the pastors and the churches and the places where a lot of people go to get information?
Thank you.
My second one is
Go ahead.
my second statement is I really support also providing some kind of legal support for evictions.
Thank you, Ms. Connor. Mr. Hardy, I saw you. Can you answer
Yes.
that?
Absolutely, we can get that. I'm not familiar with the documents myself, but we'll get a copy of them and we'll get them over to city council members. I think it's important to note too that the eviction moratorium is temporary, and it's clearly not even working, and to a large extent. So, we've got, to Councilwoman Sample's perspective, really sitting in on even just 30 minutes of an eviction hearing when no one is showing up because they're on Zoom and most people don't have access to that or even know that they need to get on Zoom. There's a huge disconnect beyond just knowing to file the paperwork, just knowing that, you have rights, period. We're so far out of whack in Akron towards the landlords that there's really nothing that is going on right now that is helping the tenants. And so we'll get all that over, but I definitely just wanted to say that the eviction moratorium will go away, and we will, whatever protections they may provide will obviously go with them.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any other comments or questions? I'd like to remind the committee that today is the third reading. Mr. Neal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize. I got caught up. So part of what I may ask or say may have already been, well, I'll tell you what, because you know what I'm going to say, because I had a chance to talk to you. Have my concerns been raised?
I don't believe so, Mr. Neal.
Okay. Well, and it's just this, and I heard I had a chance to talk to someone who's from the, I'll use the term tenant side, fair housing group. And I've had a chance to talk to some of the landlords, people that have been in own property for a long time. And with 100% transparency, I shared that, I've been a landlord for 30 plus years. I just, my concern is I want to make sure that we have balanced legislation. And I'm hoping, I did get a chance to speak briefly with Ms. Rose. I reached out to you, Ms. Hardy. Sorry I didn't get a chance to catch you. Not to hold this up, but I think this is, and the landlords I spoke to want this as well, to set up a tenant landlord council that works together to bring best practice and policy together and to educate both sides. The major concern I heard was over the capping of the late fee. And a lot of that is because it's tied into, there's different ways that people purchase their property, be it on a traditional mortgage or what's considered a hard money loan, a private loan, on a credit card. All those things come into play, and their mortgages have different rates and fees with them. That was a major concern I heard regarding the legislation. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being able to share.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Mr. Hardy?
Thank you, Councilman Neal. Happy to, I'll get back with you on that. I think a tenant landlord advisory group makes a lot of sense. We've been talking about it. I think we should pursue it. I'll follow up with you on ideas that you may have gleaned from the landlords in terms of the cap on late fees to see if there's some movement there. But I also just want to say again that to a lot of us, this legislation is super simple. It really comes down to one question, which is, in 2021, should it be legal for a property owner to deny housing to someone based on the fact that based on the ability for them to pay? What type of legal tender they're using to pay? It's a really simple question. And I think that we can absolutely suss out all of these different concerns. But I think ultimately part of the reason why we're not getting really strong opposition coming before this council just yet is because all of us would answer in the affirmative that in this day and age, if you've got the money or you've got the ability to pay and it's legal, you should get that housing. So we just have to work through the nuts and bolts of the legislation. But I think it ultimately comes down to that we can't continue to say that, yes, you can pay, but we aren't going to accept that. I think that's really, at the end of the day, what we're trying to stop here.
I agree, Mr. Hardy. Thank you for that. We did hear last week, though, from MHA, and some of the landlords that we view, and you're in the right, I think, in terms of, not many voices heard publicly But we had heard that, yes, whenever you deal with government, there's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of red tape for landlords to deal with. And that, and I think that's part of the resistance. I can't answer about the other resistance. And I think that's what the focus is here. And I get it and I understand it. But some of those folks, they don't want to go and have to deal with that part of the cumbersome task of dealing with a level of bureaucracy. They would rather have the market dictate, but I get it, what the intent of the legislation is, and I understand it totally. And that's what some of the concerns that have been brought forward. So we'll continue to work through all these issues and continue to get everyone's questions answered. Okay, Ms. Samples, I saw your hand first.
Just briefly, I want to piggyback a little bit off of what Councilwoman Amobian brought up about having funds available for a landlord to represent a tenant. And I mean, that's something that we could see doing sooner than later, maybe involving the public defender's office in that, since they're already charged to be at the municipal court, and maybe some funding sources going to them to represent a tenant who may need legal representation. I think it's really one of those things where a lot of them don't understand the rights that they have. And if they have an attorney that's already at the courthouse, I think it would give them a lot more ease to get through the process, and they actually would probably show up to court if they actually knew they had somebody there to represent them. So we have a source that's there, which is the public defender's office. I don't think we should have to go and reinvent the wheel because they're already there. Maybe that's something that James or Tamika can look into to see if how something like that could even be a possibility. I don't know that part of it, but I think that a lot of more tenants would show up if they actually knew somebody was there to represent them.
Right. No, I agree. A couple of years ago, I looked at that court system there and certainly realized that oftentimes the people going into court, they don't have full knowledge. They don't have representation. They don't have, the resources, obviously. So try to push toward seeing that happen so that people have access and are just simply reminded about court dates and such. I mean, there's so much that we could be doing, but we're not. But thank you for those comments, Ms. Sample. Ms. Rose?
Thank you, Chairman Fusco. Councilwoman Samples, one of the things that I can say is that legal aid has been fighting this battle long before we brought this to the table. They were part of the reason that we have brought the legislation forward, and they have been working with the courts. So everything that you guys have mentioned, they have requested to do for the court. They will be glad to represent any tenant in a that fits within the income guideline requirements. They will be glad to help any tenant. They are at the courthouse all the time. They've asked for the courts to provide a pamphlet on the eviction to let them know what their rights are. And I don't know if that's moved forward, but there are groups out there that are trying to work with the courts, and then they get pushed back, because I think we can all recall that there was the removing the eviction, having eviction ceiling, right? And that failed in the courts. They were moving forward, and then the landlords came forward and were like, no, we don't want to do that. And so that then prohibits good standing citizens that may have had an eviction 10 years ago that were trying to then go and buy a home now with their credit rating. So it's just different things that legal aid has tried to help with educating tenants that they have been pushed back upon. And when we talk about making the system fair, I think legal aid has been front and foremost, along with the Fair Housing Contact Service, to help tenants in making sure that they are aware of their rights.
No, thank you, Ms. Rosa. And that's the thing, I think we're all sharing, at least all can support and probably vote sooner, putting resources toward this to educate those tenants, especially what their rights are and what their options are. And that's been a big failure of our system, I think. And that's, no, thank you for those comments. Appreciate it. All the comments today. Mr. Malik?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to get out of order if we're still continuing the data discussion, but I know that we also have Mr. Michael Lepley from Cleveland Fair Housing, who is going to speak to a source of income. So I don't know if it's appropriate now or later on in the meeting.
Well, I was going to do that.
Sorry.
I was just going to ask any council members at this time if there was any questions from anyone else in reference to this at this point. And if there wasn't going to be, I was going to ask you to go ahead and introduce your guest here. So, Mr. Lepley, is that it?
That's
yeah.
right. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Councilman Malik for the invitation. He reached out to my agency for someone to come and speak to you today. My name is Michael Lepley. I'm the Senior Research Associate at the Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research. We're the fair housing nonprofit serving Cuyahoga and Lorraine counties. And I've been doing research on source of income, on housing voucher discrimination for about 5 years in our service area. And today I'm going to briefly share some of our findings and then some of our experiences with enforcing a source of income law. I don't have any slides for today, just to kind of keep the presentation brief, and I'm going to reference some research. If anybody would like to read a little more deeply, feel free to reach out, and I can provide links to any of the research that I'm going to reference today.
Sir, please, sir, if you don't mind, if you could send it to me or Shamus, we'll make sure that all council gets that information.
Okay.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So in 2016, my agency released a report where we studied the location decisions of folks in the housing voucher program in Cuyahoga County. So to give you some background about our county, that's about 16,000 households, 90% of whom are African American. And in Cuyahoga County, amongst Black renters, that represents 1 in 7 Black renters. And doing a spatial analysis, what we were able to show was that folks in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, or the program itself, statistically contributes to racial segregation in Cuyahoga County. So the Cleveland metro area is one of the 5th most racially segregated large cities in the United States. And we argue that the voucher program is a contributing factor to that. With the help of our housing authority, we interviewed, I should say we surveyed hundreds of folks in their program, and we learned that the number one issue, the number one thing that decreases housing choice for this group is that landlords more often than not refuse to participate in the program, which in most jurisdictions is their legal right. We did a follow-up report to this study in 2017 where we used a technique called testing. This is an investigatory technique that uncovers housing discrimination. It's sometimes called the secret shopping of housing. So in this follow-up study, we sent out we engaged in hundreds of interactions with landlords to kind of understand how they are behaving in the market. So for the sake of time, I'm going to skip to the results. But again, if you're interested in talking more about the methodology or reading about our methodology, I can provide the report. But what we were able to show in this study was that in Cuyahoga County, outside of areas that already have concentrations of housing vouchers, landlords refused to participate in the housing voucher program, i.e. they told our tester, no, I will not take your voucher, 92.1% of the time. We then did a follow-up methodology using testing again, but this time to detect racial discrimination. And in the fair housing world, there's been kind of an assumption that we call it source of income race as a proxy, whereas someone can refuse a voucher as a legal form of discrimination when their hidden excuse me, their hidden intent is to engage in racial discrimination. So we wanted to ask this question and have evidence to this question. So what we did was we identified rental units that said no Section 8 in their ad, and then we sent a match paired race test. So this is where the landlord who said no Section 8 in their ad would be engaged by a Black renter and a white renter who were equally matched in every way. And what we were able to show using both an experiment group and a control group was that landlords who put no Section 8 in their rental ads are more likely to engage in racial discrimination, regardless that this testing protocol did not use a voucher. So what we argue based on our evidence is that in Cuyahoga County, when landlords refuse to accept a housing voucher, they perpetuate racial segregation, whether they intended to or not. But because of the second piece of testing, we argue that some actually do intend to, which is why we believe in the need for a source of income protection. And it's why it is a part of our regional effort to increase racial equity in our service area. Now I want to talk a little bit about our enforcement experience in Cuyahoga County. So in Cuyahoga County, we have 4 inner ring suburbs that have passed source of income ordinances. Some are coming up, some were passed as long ago as 2012. So they're going to be about 10 years old in a little bit, and some are fairly recent. But for your reference, the cities that have source of income laws in our service area are the Village of Lindale, the City of South Euclid, University Heights, Warrensville Heights. And then we expect by the end of May that the City of Cleveland Heights they've engaged in 1 or 2 readings of their source of income ordinance. And we expect that Cleveland City Council is soon going to introduce an ordinance to include source of income as part of their fair housing law as well. But based on our experience as an enforcement agency and an advocacy agency engaging in these cities, I wanted to generalize a little bit based on our experiences in Cuyahoga County. So we have experienced some hiccups with some of the cities, and we've learned from engaging. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, and I think this is especially true in smaller suburbs, and I'll also say that, I'm not, you have a very capable fair housing agency serving the city of Akron. So I'm much less familiar with fair housing enforcement agency, but in some of our cities, we were having an issue. With the internal infrastructure that cities had in place, and we learned that this was crucial in the enforcement of their source of income laws. So, however your civil rights ordinance is written, it probably defines a position or a community board of folks who are charged with enforcing the law. That's pretty typical in a lot of cities in our region. Those folks need to be trained on the mechanisms of the law. If they receive a fair housing complaint, they need to know what the processes are defined in the law. They probably need to be defined or be trained generally on civil rights theory. And then in a lot of cases, they probably need to have close communication or trainings from your housing authority so that they understand the voucher program and some of the subtleties of that program. The other issue that we ran into, which I'm not sure if you have a draft legislation yet. I can't remember where you are in the process, so I apologize.
Yes, for your information, sir, today's our 3rd reading.
Oh, okay, excellent. So then this is a little less relevant, but I was going to say that one of the biggest issues that we faced is the definition of source of income in your ordinance. So we had several cities that simply wrote they included source of income as a protected class with no definition, and landlord with a good lawyer can argue successfully that a voucher is technically not a source of income. So, there needs to be a definition that of a definition of source of income that explicitly includes housing vouchers or other sources of subsidized housing that you might want to include. And then after that, for most of our cities, it's been pretty quiet. Once they get the mechanisms in place and they're up and running, it just kind of works. And the federal data, in 2016, HUD did a massive 5-city investigation about the effects of source of income laws, and what they were able to show, it wasn't the way that they designed their experiment wasn't causal, but it implies that once the source of income is passed in a city, it has a 40 to 60% reduction in landlords refusing to accept vouchers. They just, the law's in place, they just comply with it. In most cases, folks they just want to do what's right, and they're going to follow the law if it's the law. So I hope this was helpful. And again, I can provide all of the research that I referenced, and I can provide some of the education materials that we've developed for the city of Cleveland as well, which summarizes some of the stuff I talked about today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And if you could please forward that over to Mr. Malik, that would be wonderful. As like I said, I'll probably go over most, if not all, of your information, and be in touch and have a couple questions for you. So very good. Is there any questions briefly for Mr. Lepley? If I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for coming in. We really appreciate it. And and it sounds like you've been obviously on the front line of this issue for some time now, for a couple of years. And I think, some of the misinformation maybe that we've heard, that I thought this was like relatively new, in terms of, and that's been some of the misinformation we've received. And so that's going to be helpful. So very good. Thank you so much. It's very good. Okay, with that, I know Miss Rose has another guest with us here today. So Ms. Tamika Rose, if you'd like to introduce our guest, and we welcome you, and we'd love to hear from Ms. Budnick. Tamika?
Thank you, Chairman Fusco. We have Dr. Amy Budnick from the Pathways Hub program, who focuses on helping at-risk mothers get to their full-term births. So I wanted to turn the floor over to Dr. Budnick. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamika Rose. Thank you, and welcome, Dr. Budnick.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity this afternoon. As Tamika shared, I am the Pathways Hub Director at Community Action Akron Summit, and I've been really fortunate to be able to apply my PhD in public health and prevention science in my work to date. I would also like to thank you for the opportunity to provide more information about the anti-discrimination source of income legislation and pay to stay legislation. As some of you know, Community Action Akron Summit has been the designated lead agency to address poverty since 1964, with our mission to reduce poverty and promote self-sufficiency. The Pathways Hub model here in Akron and Summit County represents a network of agencies that employ community health workers, and we utilize a single data system, so we're able to track this information across the system. The hub model allows community action and our partner agencies to track clients' risk factors over time. And so we're able to look both at an individual and a system level for barriers. Community health workers assess families' needs, and they also, during that time, open and close pathways that correspond with these needs and most likely with social determinants of health. They'll also provide education and coordination of referrals and resources in the community to help support those healthy birth outcomes. As many of you know, in Akron and Summit County, disparities between Black and white infant mortality in some areas are almost 3 times that of white babies. And many of those outcomes are attributed to prematurity, which we know are directly connected to our social determinants of health, whether it's stress, access to healthcare, nutritious food, and of course, unstable housing. And when we think about the work that we're doing within the hub, I'm happy to share some of our experiences to date. I started reflecting over the past 5 years that we've been doing this work, and I came upon a definition of home by a 5th grader, Wynn, who was asked by Habitat for Humanity to describe, what does home mean to you? And his words were, home means an enjoyable, happy place where you can live, laugh, and learn. It's somewhere where you're loved, respected, and cared for. When you look at it from the outside, home is just a house. Just like memories, home is also where your hopes and dreams are. I can relate because I have a 6th grader who oftentimes says the most profound things. So I wanted to share what Wynn said. And when I think about the context of our social and psychological impact of what home means for our families and how that intersects with health, and how the significance of stable housing is so important to health outcomes. We know that research tells us unstable housing, fear of homelessness adds to increased stress, mental health, poor well-being, and we know now that poor health outcomes are so deeply tied. Not only do people get sicker, but they die younger when we have these kinds of unstable housing. And oftentimes what happens that we'll see is that families start to postpone many needed services when their housing's unstable. So whether it's routine medication, routine doctor's appointments, and we know that this often then creates disruptions in employment, education, and then ultimately our social networks and communities. On the flip side, when we see stable housing, especially amongst our women in our program, we know that that reduces financial stress. We start to see improvements in health and well-being, and that's been supported by lots of research through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Our families have an option when their housing is unstable. They don't always have the option where they may have to postpone care. They may have to consider other alternative places to live. I'd like to share some of the data that we have that's live to date. I did a 2-year look back, and when we look at 62% of our clients, they reported that they were renters in our program between 2019 and 2021. Of that, 28% of our clients reported living with family, friends, in a hotel, in a shelter, and staying in different locations. We know 6% reported that they were homeless. And when we have heard stories from the field from our community health workers, we oftentimes will hear that women are bouncing between different locations, sleeping on the floor, sleeping on a couch, going in between shelters based upon what's happening in their family situations. What's unique about our project is that we're able to measure and quantify these stories using our pathways. And so when I took a look back at our 2-year time frame, we've had 127 housing pathways initiated. So that means that the community health worker the family shared with the community health worker that they have this need. And of that 127, sadly, I can report that 26 had successful outcomes and 45 were unsuccessful, and the remainder have now remained open, and they're looking for this kind of stable housing through a period of time. We know not only does it take longer once you've lost housing, but we know that it becomes more challenging as depending on what happened as to why you lost your housing. I also took a look at the kinds of referrals that are happening within our system for social service pathways. And again, we saw that 212 of our families had open housing assistance referrals, and about 50% of them were able to successfully have that need met. So we know things like community legal aid is a partnership that we work with, some of the rental assistance programs, some of the education programs that provide this kind of information were successfully met with our families. We know that these pathways are impacted not only by the availability of affordable housing, but also the financial ability to pay for housing. And we know that in times when, not only given the COVID-19 pandemic, but pregnancy brings upon unexpected circumstances. If a child delivers early or prematurely, That impacts the woman's ability to continue employment. If there's complications medically, that also may impact it as well. But our hope is that they're short-term. By staying engaged in our programs, by staying tightly connected with community health workers who can help coordinate and wrap around these resources, the hope and our commitment as Community Action is that we help families remain self-sufficient, right? And we promote these kinds of overall well-being for their health. We know that research has shown that housing is a protective factor for families. It stabilizes families and communities. Our families rely on this kind of stable housing so that we can have healthy birth outcomes. We cannot continue to lose 3 kindergarten classrooms of babies. And if housing is such a significant piece to us ensuring that our future stays fruitful and rich and hopeful, we have to support these kinds of legislation and services for our families. And I'll always think about when, as we think about our description of home. So I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Budnick. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon and sharing with us. Certainly appreciate it. Thank you. And thanks for all you do. Questions or comments from anyone on council, any committee members? Okay, very good. At this point, I will make a motion that we take time on the 2 items that we have on our agenda. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor of taking time signify by saying aye.
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 Against? Very good, thank you. We will take time. And thank you all for attending this afternoon. Short of any other comments or questions, I'm not seeing any, we will be adjourned. Thank you. Turn it over to Sarah Viviano.
And that is our final committee meeting of the day. Council will meet at 7 p.m. tonight. Thanks, everyone.